Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me again on We the Podcast. Sorry if you were attempting to watch my stream about an hour ago. I had something come up and had to briefly stop and restart it now. Um, so, today we are going to be speaking about the Epstein Files, transparency, justice, and accountability. Um, so, I'll open, I'll open up being pretty blunt. Um, if your daughter were kidnapped, if she were trafficked, if she was sexually abused, sold, or silenced, there would be no politics. There would be no left or right. There would be no patience for secrecy. You would only have one demand, and that demand would be justice. So, why would anybody not want justice? Tonight's episode is going to address the Epstein Files and why the partisan warfare surrounding them must stop. Because justice is not partisan. Justice is not universal. Justice cannot apply only to those without money, power, or connections. This episode will ask a simple question. Is a society that claims to protect children willing to confront the truth, even if it implicates powerful people? And with that being said, the Epstein files must be released. This should not be a controversial issue. It should not be political. It absolutely should not be partisan. Anything else is complicity in what may be the largest institutional cover up of child sexual exploitation in modern history. It does not matter if some people demand release for political motives. Releasing the files does one thing and one thing only. It exposes those who participated, facilitated, enabled, normalized, funded, transported, recruited, or even protected the abuse. Then and only then can we begin enforcing justice for the victims. Representative Thomas Massie put it plainly when discussing the Epstein Files Transparency Act. How will we know if this bill has been successful? We will know when rich men are being perp walked in handcuffs to jail. Until then, this is still a cover up. That needs to be the standard. Not headlines, not promises, not press conferences. Handcuffs, trials, and convictions. That is what justice looks like. And before we go any further, if you value this kind of principled, nonpartisan constitutional analysis, please do me a favor and like this episode, subscribe and follow, share it with someone who still believes equal justice should apply to everyone. And if you want to learn more about the congressman leading the charge for this transparency in this case and why so few in Washington are willing to do it, my book, The Last Republican, Thomas Massie and the Death of a Party, goes into deep detail as to who Thomas Massie is and what he stands for. And before we dive in further on the topic of the Epstein files, I do have one urgent note that I would like to talk about, especially for those who reside in Virginia. The Virginia State Senate recently passed legislation supporting the National Popular Vote movement. It is a plan that would bind Virginia's electoral votes to the winner of the National Popular Vote. This now moves to the Virginia House of Representatives, and it is not a minor procedural tweak. The National Popular Vote fundamentally alters the constitutional structure of presidential elections and weakens the Republican form of government guaranteed to every state in Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution. It removes the state as a political entity in presidential selection and replaces it with a single national tally dominated by major metropolitan centers. This is not how our constitutional republic was designed to function. Federalism is not an inconvenience. It is a structural protection against concentrated power. I will address this issue in full in a dedicated episode with the same depth and seriousness that it deserves. But because this legislation is moving now, I feel compelled to strongly encourage listeners, especially those in Virginia, to contact their representatives and oppose it. Preserving the constitutional structure of our republic matters, and we will return to that topic as soon as I have the opportunity to cover it in depth. Tonight, we are turning to justice and accountability. So, for my first segment here, what does releasing the files actually mean? When people hear the phrase release the Epstein Files, a lot of them picture the tabloid drama. That's not what it is. This is about restoring the public record in a case where the justice system repeatedly acted behind closed doors and where secrecy constantly benefited the connected. So let's define the terms. Release the files does not mean leaking victims' names. It does not mean publishing explicit material. It does not mean turning rumor into conviction or using politics as a substitute for evidence. What releasing the files does mean is protecting victims perfectly. Victims' names, identifying details, images, and any information that could re-traumatize, expose them, or endanger them. Releasing non-victim names and relationships. That includes the names that appear in communication logs, contact records, flight records, scheduling records, business dealings, and correspondence, when those names reflect meaningful interaction with Epstein's network. Releasing the government's own work product, not summary by press conference, not trust us, not actual, it's the actual documentation, communications, logs, records of meetings, internal memos, and paper trail showing what was known, when it was known, and what was done or not done. Because if you release the files in a curative narrative, you are not releasing the files. You are releasing a story. And stories can be managed. The reason this matters is simple. Epstein did not operate like a lone criminal in the shadows. He operated a network, a system of access, money, legitimacy, protection, and silence. Private planes, private islands, private residences, private introductions, private favors, and then private deals inside the justice system. That is what makes this case different. Not only the evil of the crime, but the repeated institutional decisions that kept the network from being exposed. And here's an important point. Transparency does not bypass due process. Transparency only restores the conditions necessary for due process to happen. Because without transparency, there is no public pressure. There is no institutional accountability. There is no incentive to reopen investigations. And there is no cost for burying uncomfortable facts. For years, sealed agreements, limited plea deals, and selective disclosures ensured that the full scope of this trafficking operation never came into public view. And when the public cannot see the full picture, institutions are never forced to answer for that failure. So when I say release the files, I mean a standard that the public can actually measure, where victims are protected, non-victim participants are no longer shielded by black ink, and the government's own actions are visible enough to be judged. Now, let me go one layer deeper, because this is where people get confused and institutions exploit confusion. When we say files, we are not talking about one neat folder. We're talking about the entire ecosystem of the records. The correspondence, so the emails, letters, and messages. Scheduling and logistics, so the appointments, the travel, the staff coordination. Contact networks, the address books, the call logs, the intermediaries, the financial and business activities, so the payments, arrangements, and introductions, and government records, the memos, charging decisions, agreements, and internal notes. Those records exist for one reason, because this was not random. Networks leave paperwork, and when networks operate for years across jurisdictions, across institutions, across elite circles, the paper trail becomes the difference between everyone suspected and somebody held accountable. That is why transparency is not optional. Because without the documents, you cannot map the network, you cannot identify facilitators, you cannot test alibis and timelines, and you cannot separate rumor from fact. And if you cannot do any of those things, you also cannot force prosecutors to explain why certain avenues were never pursued. So when someone says, I support releasing the files, but, you should immediately ask, but what? But protect who? Because protecting victims is not the controversial part. The controversial part is whether powerful adults get to keep their anonymous status after years of institutional failure. And in this case, the anonymous status has functioned like immunity. Not because a court granted it, but because the public was never allowed to see enough evidence to demand accountability. That's the difference between a system that prosecutes crimes and a system that manages scandals. Under normal circumstances, ongoing investigations can justify temporary redactions. You saw that during the Maxwell trials. They could not release any of the information during that because it could cause a mistrial. But that principle exists for a reason. It also protects innocence. It protects public accusations from becoming public punishment. It keeps investigators from tipping off targets and contaminating witness testimony. But here's the problem, and the problem that you can't ignore in the Epstein case. In this case, ongoing investigation has functioned like a permanent escape hatch, an elastic shield, a disguise, a way to cover wrongdoing and protect powerful individuals and delay consequences indefinitely. And we've talked about this before. In episode 4, we discussed what happens when government investigates itself. Too often it finds no wrongdoing. Too often it protects itself, and too often it buries its own crimes. In the Epstein case, we see a similar pattern. Hiding behind ongoing investigations, sensitivity, sealed materials, and a stack of other excuses, the system appears to be doing what it has done for decades. Shield the powerful, delay scrutiny, protect reputations rather than protect children. And this creates a dangerous incentive structure, not just delay, but leverage. Because if under investigation becomes the magic phrase that keeps names hidden, then the longer an investigation drags on, the longer secrecy can be maintained. And in a case like Epstein, where time is already the ally of the guilty, that's not a safeguard, it's a weapon. And notice the pattern this creates. If you want to protect someone, you don't even have to finish the investigation. You just have to keep it ongoing. Because ongoing becomes a blanket. And the longer it stays ongoing, the longer the names stay hidden. Meanwhile, the victims age, witnesses disappear, memories fade, evidence goes cold, and public attention moves on. So even if an investigation technically exists, secrecy can still function as an outcome, a quiet way to ensure that nobody ever pays a price. That's why the Epstein Files Transparency Act matters. This case is not ordinary. This was not a lack of evidence case. This was a lack of will case. Naming involvement in official records is not declaring guilt. Courts convict. But transparency forces the machine of justice to move again. It forces questions and testimony. It forces real investigation that can no longer hide behind secrecy. And to be clear, this does not bypass due process, it restores it. Because secrecy did not protect due process in this case, it froze it. And when justice is frozen long enough, powerful people quietly age out of consequences. And as I said, evidence goes cold, victims are forgotten, and accountability becomes impossible. Transparency is the thaw. It forces the system back into motion. And now a critical point. The demand for transparency does not mean sacrificing the victims. Victim protection is not negotiable, I mean. If victims' names, images, or identifying details are exposed, that's not transparency. That's a second violation. And in many ways, it's the state repeating the harm. And constitutionally, it is completely backwards. This failure is not merely ethical, it's constitutional. The Constitution does two things deliberately. First, it establishes government authority, not only in a limited, but only in a limited and enumerated form. Secondly, it exists to secure the natural God-given rights of people against abuse of that authority. Government power is granted. It is not assumed, and it is granted conditionally. That means government does not get a blank check to expose private citizens in the name of convenience. Among the protections embedded in our Constitution are basic rights to security of one's persons, private life, and one's dignity. Reinforced through due process and the idea that the state must not turn citizens into collateral damage. Victims do not lose their rights because the government opens a file. Victims do not surrender constitutional protections because prosecutors fail to do their jobs. So when the DOJ accidentally releases unredacted victim information that is not a minor error, that is a failure of duty. And this happened last week. And after it got exposed, they immediately pulled down very sensitive information that released victim names, imagery, and otherwise. And this is precisely why the only moral and legally acceptable redactions are the victim's protections. And it needs to be executed perfectly, consistently, and without exception. If you are a victim of sexual violence, the state does not get to expose you to the public as the cost of transparency. The state exists to secure your rights, not gamble with them. And that protection is not merely moral. It's tied to the entire American theory of government: limited power, individual rights, and due process. That's the difference between a constitutional republic and a regime. Victims must always be protected. No balancing test, no situational carve-out, no exceptions. And if the Department of Justice cannot release documents without exposing the victims, then the Department of Justice is failing at the most basic level of competence and obligation. So moving on to my next segment, I want to talk about why uncharged individuals is not a shield in this case. One of the most common objectives to releasing names is that these people were never charged. Under normal circumstances, this concern carries real weight. In ordinary cases, the presumption of innocence and the risk of reputational harm justifies caution. But once again, the Epstein case is not ordinary. This is not about a single suspect, a single allegation, or an unresolved event. This is about a long-running, documented criminal enterprise that was known to law enforcement, prosecutors, and political institutions for years. And the failure here was not a lack of evidence. Naming someone in a government file is not a conviction. It's not a trial. It's not a sentence. But permanent anonymous status after decades of inaction, sweetheart deals, sealed records, and institutional protection becomes its own form of injustice. At some point, secrecy stops protecting due process and starts obstructing it. That point was crossed long ago. Because what secrecy did in this case was not preserve fairness. It preserved immunity. So this release is not about declaring guilt by association. It is about forcing explanations that were never demanded. Why were you repeatedly in Epstein's orbit? Why were you flying with him, funding him, doing business with him, or socializing with him after his conduct was known? What did you know? What did you ignore? And who protected you from having to answer those questions? Due process happens in court. Transparency can happen before that, by exposing facts that make lawful investigations possible. And to be clear, the Transparency Act does not bypass due process, like I said. It prevents the system from using secrecy to avoid due process. If someone did something wrong, if something did nothing wrong, transparency helps them. If someone did do something criminal, transparency makes prosecution possible. But here's the deeper point. In a functional system, uncharged is often a temporary status. In this case, uncharged has been used as a permanent shelter. And when the state itself contributed to that outcome through delay, sealing, hesitation, and protection, it cannot then turn around and use uncharged as a moral shield against public accountability. Because the lack of charges may itself be evidence of failure. So the standard has to be this. Transparency is a prerequisite to legitimate prosecution. Without it, the system can keep everyone perpetually uncharged and therefore perpetually protected. And that is not justice. But secrecy is not due process, and silence is not innocence. There are some redactions that they have been doing that should never be accepted, not legally, not morally, and not in the pursuit of justice. When documents appear to contain admissions, coordination, facilitation, or known sexual exploitation, blacking out the adult sender's name is not victim protection. It is state-sanctioned anonymous status. Sorry, English can be hard sometimes. But it's a state-sanctioned anonymous status for a potential perpetrator or facilitator. And that distinction matters because every time a non-victim name is redacted in this case, one of two things happens. Either the public is prevented from understanding the full scope of the trafficking network, or the burden of accountability is shifted away from those with power and back onto the victims. Both outcomes are unacceptable in this case. Justice for victims does not begin with silence. It begins with truth. And truth requires identifying the people who enabled, financed, normalized, facilitated, and knowingly ignored the abuse. Sex trafficking networks do not survive on secrecy alone. They survive because other people provide access, money, legitimacy, introductions, and protection. They survive because the wrong people are willing to look away. And they survive because institutions treat powerful names as sensitive instead of treating children as sacred. Redacting those names does not protect anybody except for those who are at fault. It protects the ecosystem that allowed the abuse to continue. For survivors, justice is not abstract. Justice means acknowledgement. Justice means validation. It means the system finally saying, we will name what happened and we will name who was involved. Without that, victims are left with the same message that they have heard for years: that their suffering is inconvenient, that accountability stops at wealthy and influential people, that the truth is negotiable. And here's the part that people need to understand: a trafficking ring is not just a predator, it is a supply chain. It has recruiters, schedulers, drivers, intermediaries, gatekeepers, fixers, and enablers. And when those roles are protected by redaction, the entire trafficking ring survives in memory, and the ecosystem survives in practice. Redacting the names of perpetrators and facilitators does not preserve justice. It delays it, and in this instance, it appears to end it altogether. After years of delay, sealed records, and institutional inaction, more secrecy does not protect due process, it forecloses it. And delay in this case has already cost too much. Measured in years of silence, in unacknowledged suffering, and in justice denied. Justice for the victims of this trafficking ring requires more than symbolic transparency. It requires naming the truth fully, clearly, and without fear of who the truth implicates. And I have a couple examples of when the redactions become protection for those responsible. And if you are watching on YouTube right now, I'm putting up one of the examples here. And this was somebody sending an email, I believe, to Jeffrey Epstein. And highlighted is a phrase saying, "A new Brazilian just arrived." It says that they are sexy, cute, and 9 years old. To me, this is one of the most sickening things I could even think of reading. But this is in the Epstein Files. And if you notice, the sender for this email is redacted. In no universe is this an innocent individual. This is clearly somebody who was directly trafficking children to Jeffrey Epstein. Very young children to Jeffrey Epstein. And in my next example, give me 1 second. In my next example, We have an email from Jeffrey Epstein to an unknown recipient. And in this instance, it says, "Thank you for a fun night. Your littlest girl was a little naughty." I don't have words for how horrific these crimes are. And people just turn a blind eye to them and say that we should just ignore the Epstein files, that we should stop talking about them. How young was the littlest girl for Jeffrey Epstein? We already know that 9 years old is not off limits for them. That's horrific. I can't fathom anybody thinking that we should stop talking about the Epstein files. We need justice. At this point, it's important to take a step back and be very clear about why these files matter. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's not a hoax. I don't know why in the world Trump would ever call this a hoax, a Democrat hoax. That's the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard. These are real victims. These are real crimes and a real sex trafficking ring. There's no hoax about it. The Epstein files are not a conspiracy theory. They are not a partisan weapon. They are not just internet speculation or political scorekeeping. They are a historical record of institutional failure, a record of who knew, who looked away, who failed to act, who obstructed justice, who benefited from the silence, and most importantly, who acted on these crimes. Releasing these files is not about satisfying curiosity. It's about restoring the basic conditions necessary for justice to exist at all. Justice cannot function in the dark. When information is sealed, buried, or selectively disclosed, accountability becomes impossible. Not because the crimes did not occur. We know these crimes occurred. But because the system never has to answer for them. Transparency is not revenge. It's how reform begins. It is how institutions are forced to confront misconduct that they would otherwise prefer to forget. It is how patterns of abuse are exposed instead of repeated. It's how victims are finally acknowledged, not as a statistic or a footnote, but as people whose suffering mattered and still matters. Without transparency, every promise of accountability is hollow. Without transparency, every assurance that this will never happen again is meaningless. Releasing the Epstein files is therefore about far more than just Jeffrey Epstein. It is about whether powerful people are still subject to the same laws as everyone else, and whether the justice system exists to protect the vulnerable or protect those connected. And it's about whether a free society is willing to confront failure honestly instead of burying it out of embarrassment or fear. You cannot fix what you are not allowed to see, and you cannot claim justice while refusing to confront the truth. And I need to be blunt here, because this is the part that genuinely pisses me off. I especially, but many people have been calling for justice in the Epstein case since the day that Jeffrey Epstein was arrested. Years have passed. Files were sealed, deals were cut, accountability was delayed. And now we're told that this is somehow a partisan issue. And that is the most absurd thing that's what pisses me off the most. When Democrats were in power, Republicans demanded the release of the Epstein Files. They campaigned on it. They promised transparency. Now that Republicans are in power, it's the Democrats and a handful of Republicans that are still calling for justice, while many others suddenly want delay, caution, and silence. Why did the roles flip? The excuses stayed the same. And that kind of leads me to what I genuinely believe is happening and why it has become so toxic. I suspect that releasing the Epstein Files is a nuclear option for Washington. Not because it would harm just one party, but because it would likely harm both. If the files are fully released, they expose Republicans, and they also likely expose Democrats. They may expose their donors, their power brokers, and people whose names never appear on campaign signs but who wield enormous influence behind the scenes. That creates a situation of mutually assured destruction. No one side can safely pull the trigger because doing so may implicate their own leadership, their own benefactors, their own allies. And that explains the pattern that we keep seeing. The moment one party is out of power, they pound the drums for transparency and justice. But when that same party gains power, the urgency disappears, the rhetoric changes, caution appears, and the files remain sealed. It's not about principle. It's now about self-preservation. For years, many Republicans insisted or believed that Clinton is in the files. And from what I've seen, it looks like he is. For many years, many Democrats have insisted that Trump is in the files. But you know what I have to say to that? Who cares? I don't care who is in the files. If Trump is not in the files, releasing them will prove his innocence. If Clinton is not in the files, releasing them will prove his innocence. Why fight against releasing the files then? If anyone is in the files, Republican, Democrat, billionaire, donor, celebrity, politician, whoever is in the files, release them and let justice be served. That is the entire point. Justice is not a team sport. Justice does not change depending on who is in office. Justice does not pause because an election might be inconvenient. I do not care who this helps politically. I care that those who participated in a child sex trafficking ring are exposed, arrested, prosecuted, and if guilty, convicted. This is something everybody should be united on. And every attempt to suppress, delay, or obstruct the truth at this stage is deeply suspect to me. So I'll say it plainly. I don't care. I don't care. I don't care. Just release the files. Arrest and prosecute the suspects and convict the guilty. Enough of the partisan nonsense. The injustice has gone on long enough. And that's where I want to close on this topic, because every social media page is partisan on this issue. And this should be the least partisan issue our country has ever seen. Stop inserting partisanship and start pursuing justice. So before I close, there is something that needs to be said plainly. None of this would be happening without people who refused to let this issue die. So I have to thank Representative Thomas Massie and every other lawmaker, advocate, journalist, and citizen who is pushing for the release of the Epstein Files and the Epstein Files Transparency Act, even when it was uncomfortable, inconvenient, or politically dangerous to do so. This fight was never about headlines. It was about principle. It was about restoring the idea that justice applies equally to everyone, even when it threatens the powerful individuals. That kind of leadership is rare, and it matters. Protect the victims, tell the truth, arrest and prosecute crimes. In a case built on secrecy, silence is not caution, it's complicity. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, I hope you like this episode. I hope you subscribe, share it. And if you would like to support this channel more, support my podcast, please check out my book. It'll also teach you more about the man behind it, the Epstein Files Transparency Act. It's called The Last Republican, Thomas Massie and the Death of a Party. The links are in the description. So with that, I'll let everyone have a good night, and I will see you next week.